for joining us instead of waiting in the cafeteria line, which I'm sure is really exciting. We're going to try not to disappoint you, and if you do have a lunch, feel free to eat it. During this, feel free to throw stuff on the stage at Dmitry, if you like, not me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Inu Manak. I'm the Fellow for Trade Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington. And I am simply delighted to be here today on stage with my friend Dmitry Grozoubinski to talk about his book, Why Politicians Lie About Trade. Now, let me start by saying that I actually read the book. All right, so that deserves a round of applause, guys. Come on, thank you. It's not that long, you can make it through it. And I think you all should read this book too. And there's copies in the bookshop. Maybe Dmitry will give you some here too. But let me explain to you why I think you should read this. Trade is not an easy subject to explain to people. I think a lot of you in this room know that really well. And it's in part because, as Dmitry talks about in the book, it covers so many different issue areas. And there's a lot of detail you have to get through in order to understand some of the basics. And I have to say, I also get a bit uneasy by the word trade expert. Some people call me that. I don't know what it means, all right? I know a lot about very little in trade. I know my tiny little subject area, but I don't know everything else. And I think one of the challenges with this is that it makes it really difficult to talk about a lot of other trade subjects in a way that's easy to understand. Now, one of the things I think is important, though, is that not knowing the specifics should not be a hindrance to having an honest conversation about the benefits of trade and the costs of protectionism. And you should not be shy about engaging in those conversations either, just because you may not know the specific article in the GATT that refers to some issue that everyone's talking about. It's okay, you can still be involved in that conversation. So, Dmitry, I want you to tell me, why should people care about trade policy? Because where I'm from, nobody really cares about it. I mean, honestly. But why should we invest time learning about trade at all?
Thank you so much, Inu. And before I start, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you who came here. If you've mistaken this for the coffee sandwich queue, I get it, you can leave gracefully. A huge thank you. Half of my acknowledgements in the book are somewhere in this crowd. So a big thank you to all of you. Thank you to Inu for reading my book. I look forward to reading it eventually. Had some good reviews. I mean, the question about why should people care about trade policy, I actually don't think that many people necessarily need to care about trade policy itself for its own sake. Trade policy of how you promote trade, all of that, I don't think that in itself needs to necessarily be a huge part of anybody's life. Where I think trade is important to understand is when it starts touching on the things that are genuinely close to people's hearts. There is currently huge conversations going on about how we deal with climate change, how we rebalance inequalities between countries and within countries, and how we manage national security and geoeconomics. And trade is coming into all of those. And so I do think that we need to meet people where they are and acknowledge that once trade starts coming into those areas, they need to understand enough in order to be able to understand the choices that are being made on their behalf. I have this incredibly boring view of politics and government, which is that it's mostly just people making choices between competing interests and priorities, and that the biggest role those of us in the policy community have is in helping them and those watching them understand those choices.
And it's great, but you know, if I think about learning about trade, it's not easy. Sometimes it can be quite challenging, right? But in your book, you do talk about how building a general awareness of issues and improving the trade debate requires a commitment to understanding a couple of basic things, or asking certain questions, right? So you talk about how you should be asking about how things work, right? So that's really important. You have to talk about who's involved in the process and what are the competing interests at play that could be pushing a certain idea forward. And once you get those basics down, You can actually be engaged in that conversation. So how about I take a real world example and then you walk me through how you would take that process, okay? All right, let's just say, okay, there's a fictitious person who's proposing to implement a 20% tariff across the board in their country. And if they're elected president, right? Now, that not real person states that this policy is, I quote, and I'm quoting something made up, it's eye for an eye, common sense, basic common sense. Since other countries have barriers too. Now, I listen to this and I'm like, okay, other people are doing this. We should probably do it. It's unfair. So how do I understand this based on the way that you tell people that we should be asking questions and thinking about these statements when politicians make them?
Well, I think what a crazy hypothetical, not based in reality. Let me pick this apart, this fictitious place and this fictitious person. I think one of the first things to do is to fight our instinct in the, I guess, multilateral trade community to react to this as if it were some insane, preposterous thing that no one could ever take seriously. We have this tendency on tariffs and protectionism to sort of, we act like we're in Pride and Prejudice and just got the vapors, like, oh my God, tariffs, who could possibly? And we have to firstly accept that normal people do not look at it this way. So the first thing to do is to take all of that instinctive reaction, go back and go, this is a tax proposal. At the end of the day, this is a tax proposal. What this fictitious person is saying on debate stages and elsewhere, in between comments about various communities eating pets, is basically the suggestion that, listen, American businesses and consumers, sorry, fictitious land, businesses and consumers, I'm really good at this.
It's not America, this is really fictional.
Bloody Canada again, are not being patriotic enough in their choices. They are being confronted with multiple sets of purchasing options, and they are choosing what they consider to be better value over something that is made in the US. And the argument is that the government should intervene to tax it. Consumers aren't being patriotic enough, the government should intervene. Okay, so that's the logic, you accept that logic for what it is, and you start to pick it apart. Is the argument that the fictitious country should make absolutely everything? Are we comfortable with a tax increase that hits everyone in the country and will hit poorer people more because everyone buys the same number of t-shirts and the best value products in basic consumption often hit the poor hardest when they go up in price? What are you hoping to achieve with this tax increase? And is it worth achieving that at the cost of consumers in this country paying more for everything, for the hit to business competitiveness? These aren't automatic yes or no answers, but it is a discussion you can have on the merits. I think where we sometimes make a mistake is by saying this is unthinkable, but it's not to most people. So we have to engage it where it is. And this is before you get into, well, how would you think other countries will react to this? And will we successfully be able to bully everyone else into not reacting as strongly? So before you get into all of those, I think if you just treat it as a proposal and unpack it that way, and you treat consumers, you treat voters as adults confronted with a choice, it's more manageable.
Okay, and I think that touches on one of the themes that recurs in your book, that paying attention is critical. But paying attention not just to those arguments that you agree with, but also those that you disagree with, and engaging with them in a fact-based way, right? But we also, you mentioned, need to keep an eye out for charlatans. And there's quite a few of them. They've been growing over time. And I think what's exhausting, you mentioned sort of how, trade experts hyperventilate when they see something. I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot. There's a lot of hyperventilation going on there on a daily basis. This is why I'm now on Blue Sky. You can find us both there. But, I think it's sometimes exhausting. It's exhausting to just read what some folks are saying, and you just don't want to respond to every misstatement of fact. It's very, very tiring. And you talk about how that you need to demonstrate where those missteps are being made and correct them and engage with that. Now, it's not so easy though, right, to do that. And one thing that I think that we do really badly in the trade community is that sometimes we just talk a little too much and get into too much detail about an issue without speaking plainly about one of the challenges in a specific policy, like tariffs, right? We try to make it a little too wonky. So can you tell me, why does the trade community mess up so much on this point? Because I feel like we're not so great at the messaging, and how do we go about fixing that?
I mean, first, let's not paint with a broad brush. There are phenomenal communicators in the trade policy space, and they do a fantastic job, so I don't want to sort of tar everybody. I do think the trade policy community benefited for a while from this sense that there was more or less broad bipartisan consensus for about a decade and a half, in a lot of major Western economies at least, on the fundamentals of a lot of what we do here. And so instead of fighting to sort of win over the public or engage in the general battle of ideas, trade policy people did what the incentives were, which is we refocused onto fighting the arguments on the margins, in the wonky conversations among regulators, in free trade agreements that no one paid that much attention to. So there were a lot of incentives for us. We didn't have to be good at communicating to the general public, because trade policy was, for a little while, generally not a huge part of the debate, and when it was often around us trying to push liberalization further. So someone would do TTIP, and it would become a hugely controversial issue, but that was about creating more liberalization, not unpicking the order we have. So partly, I think, we got good at speaking to wonks and to the policy process, because that's what was being called for us. And now we find these issues dragged into the public debate, and the muscles have atrophied of how you get up onto the soapbox. So that's something that we're all having to relearn in real time. So I think that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is, listen, the whole thing is changing so fast. No one knows how to communicate with anybody anymore, because these things are evolving so quickly. Political campaigns are having to relearn in real time how they reach people where they are, because the tropes of campaigning even 10 years ago don't apply today. People are consuming information in different ways. So I think lots of communities are struggling with this. On the question of Twitter and how to handle that fire hose, as someone who lives on that platform, I guess I've learned a couple of hard lessons in terms of filtering who I engage with. I basically apply two tests when I see something infuriating. My first test is this message likely to be influential? There are a lot of people who invest a lot of time and effort fighting with someone for an audience of about 13 people because you're deep dive in the mentions. Now, if that's cathartic for you, I encourage you to do it. But if that is draining your soul, as it does mine, basically I have learned to go, sometimes people are wrong on the internet, and that is okay. I do not have to personally slay every dragon on Earth. The second test I apply is the person arguing in good faith or bad faith? And you just get a nose for it. There are people who will be wrong in a genuine way because our subject matter is so counterintuitive. Nothing works the way you think it should, the way if you read the title. Huge thank you to this building for naming it MFN, by the way. That is confusing everyone on Earth. So, sometimes people are genuinely wrong and they've come to it from a good place and they're open to learn. Sometimes they are looking for a fight, looking to antagonize, or looking to make a point. And there you have to really apply the will this person shape opinion? And if they won't, they are not worth your time, because they're actually actively trying to degrade your value as an expert by wasting your time and giving you the sense that this is all hopeless. There is nothing like a 15 tweet back and forth exchange with someone who came to the discussion because they hate you, and to demonstrate how much they hate you, to make you think that engagement is worthless and that you should just go back to writing papers for experts and not engage with the general public. So you have to practice some, I guess, you have to protect yourself a bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I like the way you're talking about in terms of you really have to gauge what that person is also trying to do, what's their motive, and sometimes people make mistakes. They, would make an error and talking about some sort of fact, and that's all right. We have to have a debate and engage in a discussion about that, right? So I think that is really, key. Let me shift a bit to one aspect of the book that I talk about. I like to pick on trade lawyers, right? My friends are here, they're trade lawyers. I love you guys, I really do. But it's really easy to pick on trade lawyers, especially on Twitter. I feel like it's like the best platform for annoying all of them. Mostly because they get worked up about, you're not nuanced enough in your debate, you didn't cite the right, part of Article 20. I don't know. It's really easy to have that conversation and to get people worked up. And then they're really obsessed with carrying around copies of the GATT, and it's just like
when they should be carrying around copies of my book.
They should. So guys, get a copy of that. So here's my question, and it's broad, but should we just blame the trade lawyers for the mess that we're in today because they haven't been carrying around copies of your book, and because they're just so nerdy? They like to get into the details. I mean, I'm guilty of this too, but should we blame them or not?
I mean, it is fun. I think at some point I say in the book that it's not punching down if the person drives a Mercedes. So I do like to have a go at trade lawyers. The one thing I say is that I think sometimes in Geneva we lose sight of the role of trade law and what it is for. And this is my perception. The trade lawyers in the crowd are welcome to storm the stage and drag me off it. But I think fundamentally trade law is about resolving disagreements about things that we fundamentally agree on and what they mean in practice. And sometimes we have allowed ourselves to believe that trade law is there to force countries to do things that they fundamentally disagree on or don't want to do. That it is sacrosanct in the same way that, say, criminal law can be, although often isn't. So I think to the extent that we can blame trade lawyers and sort of the Institute of Trade Law is potentially contributed to the complacency. This sense that if protectionism starts to arise, if populists start suggesting sort of very drastic things, we can always say, yes, but we have trade law to prevent that. And for a while that might have been true, but I think sometimes we were tempted to lose sight of the fact that when push comes to shove, the illegality of something under international trade law is an argument and it is a factor in a decision-making equation, but it is not some Uno reverse card. You can walk into a politician's office, play on their table, and they immediately withdraw any suggestion of their very popular or rhetorically forceful ideas. It's simply, I don't know if it ever worked that way, but certainly it doesn't appear to be working that way universally now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in most of my conversations I have in Washington in the last several years, and I say, that probably violates WTO rules, I get a shrug emoji. I feel like that's pretty much the reaction. So I think you're right that, we need to sort of change the terms of that debate and actually engage.
That's a comparatively mild emoji compared to what you might get.
I can't tell you all the emojis I get. I'm sorry. That's not appropriate for this forum. But okay, let's talk about trade experts, right? Those that work on policy, those that work on law, and those that practice trade. Those are the categories that you bring up in your book. Now, I review books for World Trade review editor, and I always ask my contributors to offer some criticism or to offer some identification of gaps in research, and I'm going to do this here for you, because I'm saying, you missed a category here, right? You missed me. I'm kind of offended, Dmitry, but Dan Dressner talks about this, the ideas industry. Now, honestly, this is really powerful in Washington. Obviously, we have a really vibrant ideas industry. I'm not always saying they're good ideas, but everyone's trying to push certain ideas. In simple terms, it's the whole apparatus of think tankers, public intellectuals, the people who are trying to influence and shape the debate. What role do you think these people play in not just the current landscape of trade, but how do they actually work in that framework you outlined for the way that trade debates actually evolve and change?
I think it's a really good question. It's an entirely fair criticism of the book. I think a proper title for the book would have been something like "Why Politically Engaged Actors Lie About Trade," but my publisher felt that was difficult to fit on the cover. So certainly, sort of when I am speaking about politicians, I am sort of half my mind is thinking about the whole universe of how politically engaged actors are operating. In terms of their roles, I think it really depends because it's such a broad universe. I think there are some think tanks and sort of organizations that are phenomenally useful in helping governments figure out the how. Bridging the gap. I always tell students at the Graduate Institute that you would be horrified to learn how much of policy is made by a 26-year-old Googling stuff with fewer like adults between that and cabinet than you would hope for. So there's a tremendous benefit in having someone who is actually looking at the research, who is talking to stakeholders, who is thinking through the like, okay, I can see what the government wants to do. Here is what they have to think about in doing it. And there's that done. There are also very good faith actors that are trying to inform the debate, whether at the political level or at the public level. Helping people understand things, introducing new ideas, trying to spur the conversation. And I think they have a role to play as well. Some of them are ideologically minded and are pushing a certain view of how the world should work. And I think especially if they're transparent about that, that's great. I think the way that we should be forming debates, forming policy, is by having libertarians fight protectionists, fight people who believe in like very much a rules-based system, and have those ideas kind of bump up against each other. So I think that's valuable. I would say, and sort of putting my Brexit trauma hat on, there is also, I think, a class of think tanks that are directly engaged in the political process, and I think exist in order to provide politicians or other political actors with ammunition or with headlines that they can quote. And I think those are some of the ones that we have to push back on especially hard when they go beyond the realms of what is true or factually evidenced. Because it is very rhetorically powerful when a politician says, you know, a new study by the Center for a Great New America Prosperity Freedom says that tariffs will make us all 50% richer. That is a rhetorically powerful argument, and it has to be pushed back on. We have to be mindful of where people are stealing valor, stealing intellectual valor, and borrowing credentials. And that is something that we all have to be mindful of and not fall into the collegiate, you know, couldn't possibly criticize a colleague or couldn't possibly criticize someone in this space. We do need to call it out when we see it.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that, you know, sometimes it's hard to always identify where certain folks may be coming from, but I think that it goes back to that point of like there are certainly policy entrepreneurs within think tanks and other places that are pushing a certain idea, like Project 2025. So, you know, this is like one of those things that I think we have to be very mindful of and think about. So, I mean, I was thinking about, you know, as reading your book, how you were able to take something really technical and just look at a really specialized set of topics within that really technical space and give it a broader perspective. And I'm asking this because I'm writing a book right now and I want some advice. Because, you know, how can we in the trade politics community like learn to write about these super technical things? Not just that, but also talk about it. Because as you said, we're engaging with people all the time that we may not agree with. We may have certain specific questions to kind of tease out the conversation and get a little bit more meat on where they're coming from. How do we actually have that conversation and then also translate that then into writing that can be communicated to folks who, like you said, I mean, you go to the offices of government, a lot of young people there, as you said, like how do we get this through to these folks? Because often you have like one sheet, a bunch of bullet points, you maybe get 3 minutes max to make an actual point at all in those conversations. What's your advice for doing that?
I think anyone who's ever been invited onto media has experienced this phenomenon where there'll be some horrendously technical process and you get invited onto something and they'll be like, you have 2 minutes, explain Brexit, go. And you're like, okay. So listen, I think you're phenomenal at this already. I would never presume to give you advice. General advice I try to offer our students when we talk to them about how to write. My process is I begin from the premise that absolutely nobody cares. And that the only way they are getting to sentence 3 of anything I have written is if I have effectively sold them in the first 2 sentences. And the way that I try to do that is by being as empathetic as possible and I try to put myself in their shoes and go, okay, what are the things that they actually care about? And how do I explain to them right from the start that what I'm about to speak to speaks to their priorities and their concerns. We all find all of this stuff fascinating, so it's really tempting to sort of wax lyrical about the things that move us. But in this information economy, when everyone has TikTok in their pocket and they are getting served all of the world's entertainment in 15-second increments, that's what you're competing with. So I think you have to really sell them on every point and grab them right from the word go of here's how this could affect your life or your work. This is what we're going to talk about. And then I try to, again, bring it back, this question of complexity and the difficulties. I always try to bring it back to choices. If you get through all of that detail and complexity, I try to bring it back to at the end of the day, somebody with access to a lever of power is going to have to pull it in one direction or the other, or leave it alone. And this is the choice that they will be making. And if you leave it at that abstraction, that level of specificity, I think people understand that because they can extol, okay, this is what that choice will mean for me if they pull it to the left. This is the decision that's being made. That is the best way I've found. I mean, listen, are you going to get thousands of people cheering you like a Taylor Swift concert for your explanation of the GATS provisions? Maybe you will. I certainly don't. But that has been my approach, and it's been reasonably successful for me.
That's great. I mean, I think that all of us have that impulse to sometimes get a little too wonky. I myself like to talk a lot about TBT, which, a lot of folks don't even know what the acronym stands for. They think it means something else on Twitter. So I feel like that makes it really challenging often to have those conversations and to get into it. But when you have a 2-minute soundbite, you better know what you're going to say in that time. But I think what you touched on too about pulling the lever, I want to focus on this a bit too, because I think what you're getting at are trade-offs, right? And I think that one of the most difficult things in trade discussions sometimes is explaining the trade-offs between taking one policy action or another. I think often we're always trying to explain why you shouldn't do something, but not often getting into the weeds of what would happen if you did, and engaging with that honestly, even if it's a bad policy idea. So, one of the challenges that I think we also have is the fact that if you look at the benefits of trade, they're widely dispersed, the costs are often concentrated. And it's the folks that bear those concentrated costs that are also very vocal. So how do we talk to these folks about the trade-offs of certain policy proposals that come out there, and how do we talk more broadly speaking about the winners and the losers of trade? Because it's really difficult sometimes to do that when you have these narratives that are quite gripping that really focus on just the costs.
I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is forever abandon this idea that we sometimes use that trade benefits everyone all the time. But by definition, it does not. Any kind of transaction, forget trade. If I'm going for a job at McDonald's and I get it, that means a whole bunch of people did not get it. And they are the losers of that. The job market has losers in the same way the trade has losers. One of the major losers in that scenario would be all of McDonald's customers, but that's a different kind of conversation. So one thing we have to do is like be really honest about what we're talking about here. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. I have angered the gods. This is what happens when you trash talk the benefits of trade in the WTO. The DG activates the rainfall. But I do think there is an element of we have to treat people like adults. And we have to say, listen, we are going to be making trade-offs here. If we make things cheaper for consumers by letting in more foreign products, that means more competition for some of our industries. And listen, some of them might not survive, and we have to have that conversation and say this is the choice before us. And I legitimately think that if we're having that discussion and we're doing it openly, emphatically, and honestly, I was just going to sound naive, but the contrast with the people saying, well, my policy has no downsides at all, or there is no cost to what I am proposing, will become more obvious, because it'll be clear who the adults in the room are and who are trying to sell you, I think your term was charlatan goods. So I think that is one way that we talk about it. I also think we have to tell more personal stories, is I think also really, really important. We at some point convinced ourselves that we could sell the benefits of trade by talking about 10-year GDP aggregate projections, and I don't know of any human being in the history of planet Earth that has ever been convinced against something they believe by a 10-year GDP model, with, just in case economists thought I was exclusively going to rip on lawyers. So those are useful statistics, a good way to think about, but we also have to sort of talk about what happens when you block baby formula from the United States. A whole bunch of people struggle to get baby formula. That is a transaction. You can tell that story, you can explain that to an ordinary person who is looking at this choice of what do we do about taxing baby formula or regulating baby formula at the border. I think we have to tell those stories as well.
Now, I think it's a great example because it's one of those moments when people throw a lot of charts out, right? And you're right. Like I love charts and I use them a lot. But I find that often when you're in a meeting room trying to explain a policy issue, why we should do something, why we should not, you can throw a bunch of charts at a policymaker, but that's not what's going to register, right? It's the story. It's the fact that during the baby formula crisis, actually, I was here in Europe and one of my friends called me and said, do you have room in your luggage? I was like, yeah, sure. I'm just going to get another suitcase and get you everything you need. But this is the reality of what we had to deal with, and it seems silly.
Inu endorsing smuggling on the floor.
Yes. You should smuggle baby formula. The de minimis threshold allowed me to do it, but that might be gone soon too. So we can talk about that later. But yeah, I feel like there are things that make it real, right? And I think we see this often, but I think it's also why sometimes trade actions are targeted to avoid some of these costs. We look at the Section 301 tariffs against China. I think that the original list of tariffs was carefully constructed to avoid putting tariffs on, consumer products before Christmas, before Black Friday, our really important shopping day. I mean, if you can't get a good deal on Black Friday, you will go to Congress and complain about that, right? So I think that that's one of the things, but I feel like those anecdotes are actually very helpful, because on the other side too, we see pictures of shuttered factories. That's a very compelling image that has a different effect, right?
And I think to give perhaps a note of optimism to the trade liberalization fans in the crowd, the fact that governments are aware that they have to craft their policies so as to effectively hide the effect, the most visible and the most easily marketable effect. You can tell that they understand that this is not an argument that is an automatic slam dunk once people really begin to think through what protectionism might mean for them. They wouldn't be worried about Black Friday sales if they thought that slapping tariffs on foreign goods in order to boost domestic factories was a guaranteed winner every time, no matter what happens. So there is a debate to be had there, and they know fear. So that's I think that should give us some hope that there can be a real discussion here.
Yeah, I have to say, your book is certainly aimed towards an audience that's both kind of general. I think that's part of what you're going for. Although you're also speaking to trade experts. I have to say, it was quite of a cathartic read for me, because I was like, oh yeah, he gets my rage sometimes, and he's channeling it very nicely. My RA actually read the book too as I was preparing for this, and throughout there were a bunch of smiley faces, LOLs, and like, oh my god. So I feel like it's something that a lot of people can respond well to, not just because you write it so clearly, but because you're speaking in a way that helps people really get the basics of what some of these trade-offs are that we're talking about. Now, for those of us with expert knowledge who tend to get maybe too weedsy, how can we get the message that you're putting here out more effectively? And how do we get people to believe us when we show clear evidence? And I think a lot of us do this all the time. We show evidence of a policy actually having a negative impact, and then it gets ignored. So how do we get better about selling that message, even if it's something like the cost of tariffs on the average household, right? Which is a common stat that's been thrown around in recent months too. So how do we explain that message in a way that can be just as compelling as what you wrote?
Well, thank you very much, and to your if the FT wants to publish smiley faces and LOL as a review, that would be really helpful. I would say, first of all, I think it is important to say that not every expert needs to be writing for a general audience. There's absolutely no reason that every single kind of deep dive researcher, every think tanker needs to be on Twitter exchanging memes in order to win the zeitgeist. There is still a huge amount of scope. If that is not an area you're interested in or comfortable in, that is absolutely fine. I do think that if that's the case, if you've got research that you're like, people should see this, but I am not someone who wants to be elbow deep in the cesspit that is social media, or I don't know how to package this for journalists, one of the things that I beg people in that position to do is to reach out to others in our ecosystem that have that as a skill set. So a lot of it is about effective partnerships. If you've got a paper people should see, but you're not good at getting in front of eyeballs, work with others who are. You don't need to feel like you have to climb this mountain by yourself. Second thing I would say is, when you are trying to be persuasive, walking people through step by step, rather than, when you say this is going to cost your household $3,400, these tariffs. That can be persuasive, but it also sounds a little bit made up. This morning, a ridiculously popular Twitter account that talks about menswear tweeted out a thread of how tariffs would affect the cost of an imported suit. And he went and called a large suit importer in the US, and he literally took you from the factory overseas, step by step, and it's like, this is what it costs at this stage, then they applied this markup, then the tariff hit of 20%, then the markup again, and then this is what you are, so you are effectively paying $240 extra for this suit versus. Masterfully done. Walking someone through, and then, because people aren't stupid, they can extrapolate that if this is what is happening to my suit, this is what would be happening to every product. Masterfully done. You don't see it that much. And we probably shouldn't be relying on menswear obsessives in order to tell these stories, but he did it phenomenally well with 2 phone calls and no trade knowledge. So part of it is just breaking down. People have no idea what is involved in exporting. People have no idea how any of this works. So walking people step by step of being like, you've gotten to the border with your box. Here are the 7 pieces of paper that you need to fill out. Here are all of the data points you need that you don't have. Here's the tariff that will be applied, and here's how it's going to get passed on to you as a consumer. This is why, if you're a foreign investor, you might look elsewhere for your next factory opening. That kind of stuff, walking people step by step, can be really, really edifying and persuasive. It takes work, it takes empathy, but I think that's the most effective way I've seen of reaching an ordinary person and explaining what that lever pull means.
Right, and I think that's exactly it, right? Like using real world examples breaking it down step by step, but then also not being afraid to have that conversation at that broad level too, right? Because I think sometimes we get this reaction of like, let me give you all this data and show you why this is going to have a problem, how this is going to affect you, but in a very broad way, right? We don't really get into it at that personal level, which I think is a very, very effective thing. So I have asked a lot of questions, but I want you all to ask Dmitry some questions too. So if there's anyone in the audience that has a question, please. Ali?
I promise it wasn't set up that way. Governments like to talk a lot about trade policy in terms of exports, and we in the trade community have to work with that. There's been a lot of discussion today about kind of telling the story of imports, but through a defensive lens, right, when imports are under threat. I mean, the Swedish government did a great job. I always point to the Swedes. They basically used one of their national dishes and said, this is where all the stuff comes from to make it. But beyond that, I mean, is there any hope to actually try and tell the story of imports, or are we only left to sort of engage with the export story or imports when they're under threat?
I think that the best way to tell the import story is to begin at the lowest socioeconomic level. And to tell the truth, which is that often the best value goods on the market, price increases on them hit the poorest first. Because the poorest, apart from everything else, are the least capable of putting patriotism or nationalism over value concerns to the extent that anyone does. So one of the things is to talk about, listen, this is what, to begin as the Swedes did, of saying this is something that you and everyone else in the country consumes, and that takes up a bigger share of the family budget for a lower income person than it does for anybody else. So you should be aware of what you're doing. And again, I often find it's beneficial to not even take a position. You don't even say, don't do this. But I just go, I'm going to make it transparent what this means, and you can make the choice, but make the choice in a transparent way. I also similarly think there is a productivity and competitiveness story of going, listen, you know, very few countries are large and diverse enough to be able to be maximally efficient producing with exclusively domestic content. So basically saying, if you do this, you make it so much harder for our factories to get the little things they need to compete globally. So I think you can also tell that story as well. And you can, we had a panel yesterday where a person, Cooper, someone who makes barrels, was talking about the sort of how hard they get hit when trade uncertainty hits, because their business inevitably involves moving stuff across borders and bringing in the things they need to make a barrel for whiskey.
It's great. You know, that reminds me actually of Ed Gresser's Trade Facts of the Week. He's at the Progressive Policy Institute, and he had this fantastic write-up ahead of Valentine's Day, which I thought was very cheeky, because he said, if you're buying your girlfriend silk underwear, lucky you that there's not a high tariff on that. But if you're buying her cotton underwear, you better pay up. So it just shows, again, like the U.S. tariff schedule, it is a regressive tax on some of the poorest families. A lot of people don't know this, but if you actually dive into the schedule, you can see it. But Ed has a way of taking a moment in time when people are going to go out there and buy stuff and talk about it in a really open and easy way. The other point, too, on exports and imports and the value that imports play in your competitiveness, I think that fact is often lost with people in some debates. In the United States, like over 50% of what we import are intermediate goods. And we don't have that discussion enough. So I think that's a really good point to bring up there. Next question, Bryce.
Hi, I'm Bryce Bashik, Global Trade Lawyer. Your book is excellent. Thank you for writing it. It's really been informative. My question for you, it's actually touching on your TikTok comment from earlier. The youngest generation of voters in America right now, we're 10 or 11 years old when the first salvos of the trade war between the US and China were fired. You mentioned kind of competing for attention. You've got this instant gratification of TikTok. How do you communicate to the youngest voters how, the consequences of this conversation we're having in their own words? Thank you.
Yeah, nothing says trade policy like asking a 37-year-old how to reach the youth. I don't know. One thing I would say is, I'm fortunate I have a fairly large Twitter following, and I feel like I'm pretty good at the platform. I have never had anything on trade really make an impact unless I was plugging into an existing conversation. I am always ricocheting off the zeitgeist rather than attempting to introduce sort of just like edification for edification's sake. Here's how the gap works, just in case you were wondering. The youth are not wondering. No one is wondering. You cannot, you have to, the way that you do it is to go back to that menswear thread example. You take an existing policy conversation, you take an existing debate, and you say, here is the trade part of it. Here is the little bit of how trade applies to this conversation we're currently having around food security, around climate change. And there, I think you have a little bit of an open door. You can get people past the first sentence much more readily if they can see that you are resonating with something they're already interested in. So that's probably the best advice I can give, short of getting really good at K-pop dance, but that is out of my scope.
Thank you. Any more questions? I'm looking over here. We have one in the back here.
Yeah, thanks, Dmitry. It's really interesting, and I don't know how you manage to communicate trade in such a clear, fashionable way. I don't know if you caught up on the president's debate last night, but one of the candidates, and I just wonder, because he probably meets your two tests of a good reach and also quite influential, are you going to take on the MAGA crowd?
I've tried, not with a huge amount of success. But yeah, no, look, absolutely. He absolutely meets those two tests. He has an immense reach, and he is operating, I think it is generous to say, in some degree of bad faith, in that the most generous way you can describe comments like that is that he doesn't know and isn't curious enough to find out that he is wrong, which for me is fairly indistinguishable from deliberate deception when you have access to all of the world's knowledge. I think it is something that is worth pushing back on. And this comes back to something I said right at the start, one of the ways that I would advise people to push back on it is not to freak out and not to act institutionally offended. Not to act like this is a norms violation, but to again, just as the vice president kind of did throughout the debate last night, take a deep breath and go, okay, what he's actually proposing. Like, I'm not against this, for example, because I believe that the WTO rules are sacrosanct, or that you couldn't possibly have tariffs on anything. We demonstratively do, and life rolls on. This is a new tax on Americans. This will be a trade-off of Americans paying more for a huge amount of things on the shelf. It'll hit the world's poorest. What is he actually trying to achieve with this? And by the way, when he is pushed on what he is trying to achieve, he has tended to come out with two completely contradictory ideas, which is we are going to raise a ton of money to pay for everything in the country, while simultaneously locking out all imports to build US industry. Pointing out that contradiction as well, I think it is fair, but not to, as we often do, sort of reject the idea just on principle, of just saying, well, couldn't possibly have tariffs on anything, because that is not compelling to, I think, the general public. They don't have the same allergy as we do, and they're certainly not compelled by the idea that it's contrary to the WTO rules, unless you go into what that means.
Yeah, I think someone from Harris's team read your book because she talked about that proposal as a national sales tax, which I thought was very good framing. And, I think some trade policy experts wouldn't talk about it that way. And I thought she hit it on the head, actually, by describing it that way and make it really accessible to who was all watching. All right, any more questions? I know there are some burning ones. Right up front.
Thank you, and thank you for a very good dialogue. I just have one question, and you were talking about that there will always be losers. So we're talking about the factories that do the pictures of the closed factories. So I was wondering, so how are you going to talk to those who have lost their jobs, and how are you going to talk to those in developing countries, for instance, who didn't get the benefits of the first wave of globalization? Thank you.
I think there's absolutely no easy answer to that, and I think we do them and ourselves a disservice when we pretend there are, when we talk about flanking policies, when we talk about sort of global tides lifting all boats. I think that the fact is we've never really figured out what to do with a 54-year-old steel worker from a town in which the steel mill was the one major employer of blue-collar workers when that steel mill closes. We can talk about sort of aggregate benefits to the economy. We can talk about consumers. We have never figured out, that person is statistically unlikely to start writing code and become a SaaS billionaire in Silicon Valley. And I think we have to be really transparent about the fact that we have failed often to manage the transition as inefficient or non-globally competitive industries have shed jobs. We have to be really transparent about that, and we have to acknowledge it as a challenge and say, listen, some people are going to be really hurt by this, and we will make it a policy priority to think about how to help them. I don't think we are ever going to get to a point where they are happy, where losing your job at an industry like that is a nothing for you, right? Factory workers are never going to be as mobile as white-collar email workers in a big city. Just in terms of job mobility, that's just the way this works. So I think we have to be honest about it, and we have to be transparent about it, and we have to make it a policy priority, not just expect the market to sort itself out. We have to be thinking ahead when we make these policies. So that's one thing we can do, and this sort of applies to developing countries as well, to basically go, when we tell developing countries to open their markets because it will have long-term developmental benefits, we cannot pretend that lifting tide will literally lift all boats. So, some are going to flounder. That is the nature of greater competition. So part of it is, I just think we have to be transparent about it, and I think we have to. For me, it's like we have to win. If we want to do it, we have to be able to win the fight on our political terms. Of saying this is to the benefit of the whole country. This is going to hurt some of you. We do have some sort of plan in place to help, but this is going to be hard. I think wishing away the problem isn't going to help.
I agree, and I have to say, just on the U.S. context in particular, I get this question a lot as well. And one of the things that I always raise is that, all right, I understand that this is a huge problem, but how does trade policy fix that? Is this really a trade issue? And my colleague Ted Alton has written a lot about this, saying, in many ways in the United States, we failed to adjust to the changing trade landscape and the competition that came with open markets. And I think this is very true, but also we failed internally to give a safety net to those folks who were going to struggle from those adjustments. So when you lose your job in the United States, you lose your health insurance too. So this is one problem that we can fix, not with trade policy, but with sensible health policy. We could have better jobs training programs that aren't trade adjustment assistance, because there are other economic disruptions that happen that are not related to trade at all. You go to the grocery store and it's automated. It's not trade taking that person's job away, it's a robot. And we could ban robots, right? I think we could do that. There could be an import ban on all robots, but it's not really a trade policy solution. So I think maybe in trade too, we have to broaden that debate a little bit and say, we have this whole set of tools at our disposal that we don't need to negotiate with anyone about. We can do it at home, and maybe we need to think a little better about how we make our economy more dynamic, more evolved to deal with some of the challenges we're facing today and all these competitive pressures, that think about the workforce for the future, not the workforce that we had in the 1950s. And I think this is another issue that we really are not good about discussing openly in the United States and elsewhere. Any other questions? I see one over here.
Hi Dmitry, thanks so much. It's great to hear from you. I've got to buy that book. You've spoken a lot today just about trade policy and tariffs. I'm interested if you could speak a bit more about trade rules. There was a time when market access was the exchange that you got for rules. As we try and do more on the rulemaking front, and with a view to an audience of governments rather than your everyday person, how do we persuade? What is your recommendation?
It's a really good question. I'm not in government affairs, and there's a reason that's true. But I think, again, you have to demystify the whole thing. When we talk about rules, it sounds very grandiose. But in essence, what are we really talking about? Rules are governments making promises to one another about what their regulations won't be. That is fundamentally what most of the international rules-based trading system is. It's a bunch of promises between governments saying, here's a bunch of ways we won't mess with trade. Why did they make them to begin with? In order to give business and investors the certitude that they can make long-term choices. They can make long-term investments that may not pay dividends for 8 years, in the certainty that 5 years into building the factory or establishing the supply chain, they won't suddenly be without something they critically need because of the vagaries of politics. So I think you have to go back to those first principles of saying, let's look at our regulatory outlook. Let's look at all of the places where we might want to regulate in the future. Can we identify any places we're really sure we won't? And in fact, where we're so confident it would be a bad idea, it'd be nice to make it even harder for ourselves in the future. And are investors worried we might do that? Legislate in that way. Can we create some certitude? And can we apply some, basically through engagement and through negotiation, tempt other countries to make similar commitments or commitments in other areas? So I think fundamentally something we've seen in Geneva, if you want to pack out a meeting in Geneva, talk about investment. Talk about how something could translate into supply chain components and into greater inflows of capital. So I think ultimately we have to get back to why we have rules in the first place and try to make the case that, hey, when you are sitting down with the Singaporean pension fund and they're considering where to put $1 billion, the rules are one of the arrows in your quiver going, you will have certitude in the following ways that you might be worried about. That is the best case I can make for kind of rules as a concept.
Thank you, Dmitry. That was really great. I guess the bottom line, rules matter. The international trading system is important and serves a beneficial role in the global economy. And we all need to get better about talking about this in a way that is accessible to the general audience. Is there one last message that you would like to say in conveying the big message of your book? If there's one thing you want people to take away, what is it?
God, I don't know. Hopefully that's not a rip-off at whatever its regular retail price is. No, I think if there's really one... The book is for two different audiences. For those of us in the trade policy community, I'm really hoping it gives you more of a language to engage with others about what you do. This is the part of trade that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So hopefully some of it is helpful in that way. For the general public, I hope that the message is trade is about choices. There is a lot of detail, but you can engage in the conversation and understand those choices. You need not be gate-kept out of the debate. And so this is something that affects everyone's lives, it affects everyone's interests, and therefore they should be in the game.
Well, thank you, Dmitry, and thank you all for being here today. Buy the book, and Dmitry's here so you can get him to sign it. All right, it's going to be worth a lot of money someday.